Mr. President, I rise this evening to read into the record a portion of the New York Times Magazine's profile piece yesterday on Ben Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. Before reading the article, though, titled "The Storyteller and the President," I want to explain briefly why I think this piece is so important for us to consider in this chamber. Mr. President, we live in a time of precipitous change, both in American government and in communications more broadly. We don't admit it enough in this body, but the Congress in the last decade plus is extraordinarily weak by historical standards. At the same time, the media is rapidly fragmenting. These two vacuums are being filled by the executive branch in ways that are badly damaging both to the separation of powers and to the idea of a meaningfully engaged citizenry. There can be little doubt that our founders would be troubled by what is occurring in our time. Washington is in the process of replacing self-evident truths with self-serving spin, and this is dangerous. For no one is entitled to his or her own facts. I sit intentionally in the desk of Daniel Patrick Moynihan in this body, precisely because he was committed to the idea of a shared set of facts before our debates began. Yet this story makes clear that the executive branch feels empowered to proclaim its own narratives. This is bigger than Republicans and Democrats. This is about the legislature's check on the executive, and it's about all of our accountability in this city to the people. To my Democratic colleagues who supported the Iran deal, does it trouble you at all that the White House displays obvious contempt of you, and for your voters and for my voters? Will you stand for this kind of fundamentally dishonest spin from future Republican administrations? Because I pledge to you that I will not, from any administration of either party. Some will say that this is just one story of one staffer who wanted to brag and got carried away. Someone who wanted to boast about how the whole world could be his canvas. But we should be clear that it is ultimately elected officials who bear responsibility for the ongoing evaporation of public trust in our time. I want to underscore this point. My comments tonight, are not about whether you share the president's view that the Iranian nuclear deal was a prudent move, or whether you share my view that it was a disaster. That is not the point at issue today. Obviously, foreign policy is critically important, but this story tonight is about whether or not we take truth seriously. It is about whether or not we care about the public trust. There is a widespread view around here that our chief job is to, quote, pass legislation, close quote. That is incorrect. Our main job, and indeed the oath that we took, is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, which is about limited government and about the separation of powers. Our job is to ensure that the nation is well governed and that the public can believe, that the public can have trust and confidence that the nation is well governed. This necessarily means that oversight is at least as important as passing or repealing particular pieces of legislation. This horrific story should be a screaming siren to all of us, of both parties. Newsrooms are obviously still struggling to understand what vigorous and independent reporting will look like in the digital age. But it remains true that freedom, that ordered liberty, will remain dependent on an informed citizenry, and that requires a serious and a free press. Good journalism, serious journalism, that takes actual facts seriously and then grapples with those facts honestly is an important and a high calling. I plan to read about 1/4 of this New York Times piece into the record, but please note that I will skip over many proper names for ease of audible understanding. Picking up then about 40% of the way into the profile, the story continues. The job that he, Ben Rhodes, had been hired to do was namely to help the President of the United States communicate with the public. And this job was changing in equally significant ways thanks to the impact of digital technologies that people in Washington were just beginning to wrap their minds around. It's hard for many of us to absorb the true magnitude of the changes in the news business. For 40% of all newspaper industry professionals have lost their jobs inside the last decade. in part because readers can absorb all forms of new news that they want from social media platforms like Facebook, which are valued in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, and pay nothing for the so-called content that they provide to readers. You have to have skin in the game, that is to be in the news business or to depend on it in a life or death way on its products to understand the radical and the qualitative ways in which words appear in familiar paste types but have yet been changed. Rhodes was singling out a key example to me one day, laced with the brutal contempt that is a hallmark of his private utterances. Quote, "All these newspapers used to have foreign bureaus," he says, "but now they don't. They call us to explain to them what is happening in Moscow or in Cairo. And most of the outlets are reporting on their world events from Washington. The average reporter we talk to is just 27 years old, and their only reporting experience consists of being around a few political campaigns. That's a sea change. They literally know nothing," he said, close quote. In this environment, Rhodes has become adept at ventriloquizing many people at once. Ned Price, Rhodes' assistant, gave me a primer on how it's done. The easiest way for the White House to shape the news, he explained, is just from the briefing podiums, each of which has its own dedicated press corps. Quote, "But then there are all these force multipliers," he said. "We have our compadres, and I reach out to a couple of people, and you know that I wouldn't want to name them." I interrupt him and I say, "I can name them," and I tick off a few names of prominent Washington reporters and columnists who often tweet in sync with the White House's messaging operation. Price laughs. I'll say, "Hey, look, some people are spinning this narrative that it's a sign of weakness," he continues, and I interrupt again. "But it's a sign of strength," I say, chuckling with him. "And then I'll give them some color," Price continues, "and the next thing I know, lots of these guys out there in the .com publishing space, and they have their huge Twitter followings, and then they'll just be putting out this message as their own," close quote. This is something different from old-fashioned spin, which tended to be an art best practiced in person. In a world where experienced reporters competed for scoops and where carrying water for the White House was a cause for shame, no matter which party was in power, it was much harder to sustain a narrative over any serious period of time. Now the most effectively weaponized 140-character idea or quote will almost always carry the day, and it will be very difficult for even good reporters to necessarily know where the spin is coming from or why. When I later visited Obama's former campaign mastermind, David Axelrod, in Chicago, I brought up the soft Orwellian vibe of an information space where old media structures and hierarchies have been erased by Silicon Valley billionaires who convinced the suckers that information was free and everyone with access to Google was now a reporter. Axelrod, a former newspaperman, sighed, quote, "It's not as easy as standing in front of a press conference and speaking to 70 million people like past presidents have been able to do. The bully pulpit by and large doesn't exist anymore," he explained. So more and more, over the last couple of years, there's been an investment in alternate means of communication, using digital more effectively, going to non-traditional sources, understanding where on each issue your constituencies are going to be found, he said. Quote, "I think they've approached these major foreign policy challenges as campaign challenges, and they've run campaigns, and their campaigns have been very sophisticated," close quote. Rhodes' innovative campaign to sell the Iran deal is likely to be a model for how future administrations explain foreign policy to the Congress. Note that. The administration is going to have a campaign to explain things to the Congress and to the public. The way in which most Americans have heard the story of the Iran deal presented, that the Obama administration began seriously engaging with the Iranian officials in 2013 in order to take advantage of a new political reality in Iran, which came about because of elections that brought so-called moderates to power in that country. This story of 2013 was largely manufactured is their verb, for the purpose of selling the deal. Even where the particulars of the story are true, the implications that readers and viewers are encouraged to take away from those particulars are often misleading and false. Obama's closest advisors always understood him to be eager for a deal with Iran back in 2012, and even since the beginning of his presidency. "It's the center of the arc," Rhodes explained to me 2 days after the deal, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was implemented. He then checked off the ways in which the administration's foreign policy aims and priorities converged in Iran. We don't have to be in the kind of cycles of conflict if we can find other ways to resolve these issues, he said. We can do things that challenge the conventional thinking that, AIPAC doesn't like this, or the Israeli government doesn't like this, or the Gulf countries don't like it. It's the possibility of improved relations with adversaries. It's non-proliferation. So all these trends that the president has been spinning, and in this sense, I don't mean it in the press sense of spinning for almost a decade, they all converged for us around Iran. In the narrative that Rhodes shaped, the story of the Iran deal began in 2013 when a moderate faction inside the Iranian regime, led by Rouhani, beat regime so-called hardliners in an election and then began to pursue a new policy of openness, which included a newfound willingness to negotiate the dismantling of its illicit nuclear weapons program. The president set out the timeline himself in a speech announcing the nuclear deal on July 14th, 2015. President Obama, quote, "Today, after 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not," close quote. While the president's statement was technically accurate, there had in fact been 2 years of formal negotiations leading up to the signing of the JCPOA. It was actively misleading because the most meaningful part of the negotiations with Iran were from mid-2012. Many months before Rouhani and the moderate camp were chosen in any election among candidates, handpicked by Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah. The idea that there was a new reality in Iran was politically useful to the Obama administration. By obtaining broad public currency for the thought that there was a significant split in the regime, and that the administration was reaching out to the moderate-minded Iranians who wanted peaceful relations with their neighbors and with America, Obama was therefore able to evade what might have otherwise been a divisive but clarifying debate over the actual policy choices that the administration was making. I'm going to repeat that sentence. By misleading the public on the date with which negotiations began and therefore seizing upon this election that happened a year later, quote, Obama was able to evade what might have otherwise been a divisive but clarifying debate over the actual policy choices that the administration was making. By eliminating the fuss about Iran's nuclear program, the administration hoped to eliminate a source of structural tension between the two countries, which could create the space for America to disentangle itself from its established system of alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and Turkey. With one bold move, the administration would effectively begin the process of a large-scale disengagement from the Middle East. The nerve center for the selling of the Iran deal to Congress, which took place in a concentrated 3-month period between July and September of last year, was located inside the White House and is referred to by its former denizens as the War Room. The White House Office of Legislative Affairs helped run the team, which included 3 to 6 people from each of several agencies, which were the State Department, Treasury, the American delegation to the United Nations, that is Samantha Power, and at times the Department of Defense, as well as the Department of Energy and the National Security Council. Rhodes was, quote, kind of like the quarterback, running the daily video conferences and coming up with lines of attack and parry. Quote, he was extremely good about immediately getting to a phrase or a way of getting the message out that just made more sense, staff members report. Framing the deal as a choice between peace and war was Rhodes' go-to move, and that proved to be the winning argument. And just to be clear, that wasn't the choice. The choice wasn't between war and peace, and they knew it. They were spinning the public, the press, and the Congress. The person credited with running the digital side of this campaign, the Director of Digital Response for the White House Office of Digital Strategy, became known in the War Room and on Twitter as, quote, at the Iran deal. That's the Twitter handle. Early on, Rhodes asked her to create a rapid response account that fact-checked everything related to the Iran deal. So we developed a plan that was like, the Iran deal is literally going to be the tip of everything that we stand up online, we were told. And we're going to map it out onto whatever we already know about the different audiences that we're dealing with, be it the public, the pundits, the experts, the right wing, or the Congress. By applying 21st century data and networking tools to the white glove world of foreign affairs, the White House was then able to track what U.S. senators and the people who worked for them and influenced them were seeing at different moments online, and to make sure that no potential negative comment passed without a tweet. As she explained how the process worked, I was struck by how naive the assumption of a state of nature must seem in an information environment that is now mediated less and less by experienced editors and reporters with any real knowledge of the subjects about which they're writing. Quote, "People construct their own sense of source and credibility now," the staffer told me. "They elect whoever they're going to believe," close quote. For those in need of more traditional forms of validation, hand-picked Beltway insiders like Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic or Laura Rosen of Al Monitor helped retail the administration's narrative. Laura Rosen was my RSS feed, the staffer said. She would just find everything and then retweet it, close quote. Rhodes' messaging campaign was so effective not simply because it was perfectly planned and executed example of a modern digital strategy, but also because he was personally involved in guiding the deal itself. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a few paragraphs that tell how Jake Sullivan and other administration players traveled to Oman to secretly meet with the Iranians in the summer of 2012. The White House point person during the later stages of the negotiations was Rob Malley, a favored troubleshooter who is currently running negotiations that could keep Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad in power. During the course of the Iran talks, Malley told me he always kept in close contact with Rhodes. I would often just call him and say, "Hey, give me a reality check," Malley explained. And he would say, "Here's where I think the president is, and here's where he'll be." He continued, Ben would try to anticipate, does it make sense policy-wise? But then he would also ask himself, how will we sell it to the Congress? How will we sell it to the public? What is our narrative going to be? Malley is a particularly keen observer of the changing art of political communication. His father, who was born in Cairo, edited a politics magazine and proudly provided a platform for Fidel Castro and Arafat in the days when the leader's words might take several weeks to travel from Cuba or Cairo to Paris. The Iran experience was the place where I saw firsthand how policy, politics, and messaging all had to come together, and I think that Ben is really at the intersection of all three. He reflects and he shapes all three at the same time, close quote. As Malley and the representatives of the State Department, including Wendy Sherman and Secretary of State John Kerry, engaged in formal negotiations with the Iranians to ratify details of a framework that had already been agreed to, Rhodes' War Room did its work on Capitol Hill and with the reporters. In the spring of last year, legions of arms control experts began popping up at think tanks and on social media, and then they became key sources for hundreds of often clueless reporters. We created an echo chamber, he admitted, and when I asked him to explain the details in the fresh onslaught of newly minted experts who were cheerleading for the deal, he continued, they were saying the things that validated what we had given them to say, close quote. When I suggested that all this dark metafictional play seemed a bit removed from a rational debate over America's future role in the world, Rhodes nodded, quote, in the absence of rational discourse, we're going to discourse the expletive out of this, he said. We had test drives to know who was going to be able to carry our messages effectively and how to use outside groups like Plowshares, the Iran Project, and whoever else they needed to use. So we knew the tactics that worked, he said. He is very proud of the way that he sold the Iran deal. We drove them crazy, he says, of the deal's opponents. Yet Rhodes bristles at the suggestion that there has been anything deceptive about the way the agreement itself was sold. Look, he said, with Iran, in a weird way, these are state-to-state issues. They're agreements between governments. Yes, I would prefer that it turns out that Rouhani and Zarif are real reformers who are going to be able to steer this country in a direction that I believe it can go in because their public is educated and in some respects pro-American. But we're not betting on any of that. Do you all remember what we heard last summer when they were testifying before us? We never heard this. We never heard that this was the spin, but they didn't actually believe it. But now here, as a guy's thinking about his next step in life, we hear the real story. I'll continue. In fact, Rhodes' passion seems to derive not from any investment in the technical specifics of sanctions or in centrifuge arrays or in any particular optimism about the future course of Iranian politics or society. Those are matters for negotiators and for area specialists. Rather, it derived from his own sense of urgency of radically reorienting American policy in the Middle East in order to make the prospect of American involvement in the region's future wars a lot less likely. When I asked him whether the prospect of this same kind of far-reaching spin campaign being run by a different administration is something that scares him, he admitted that it does. Quote, "I mean, I would prefer a sober, reasoned public debate after which members of Congress reflect and then take a vote, but that's impossible," he concluded. Mr. President, I'll submit the entire article into the record if I might. But Mr. President, truth is bigger than talking points, and self-government deserves more than spin. Does President Obama think that there is such a thing as domestic propaganda? Does he think that it's okay? Do we in this chamber think that it's okay? Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back.